We spoke a lot about pollution and pollution regulation in Chapter 10. We only touched on the question of using incentive-based regulation, and turns out to be really important to use taxes and pollution permits rather than what we call command and control regulation. And command and control regulation is where the government says, oh, all firms must clean up 50% of pollution. And it seems fair. And for local pollutants, things like mercury that's emitted from coal plants and all precipitate out of the air within a mile of the smokestack, probably command and control makes sense. But for regional and global pollutants like sulfur dioxide, a common air pollutant, or carbon in the atmosphere, incentive-based regulation, taxes or permit trading is vastly superior, and I'm going to explain a little bit why. The key insight is to see that if we're going to achieve the desired amount of cleanup at the lowest possible cost, all firms cleaning up should have the same marginal cost, the same cost of cleaning up one more unit of pollution. And this is one of those things that's easier to explain why it must be so by explaining why if it were not so, we could reduce costs. So let's say we had firm A and firm B, and firm A could clean up one more ton at $50, and firm B, their last ton or their next ton cleaned up would cost them $500. Well, if we reallocated responsibility for cleanup away from firm B, let's say shift one unit away from firm B, we save $1,000 there in cleanup costs. And if firm A cleans up one extra ton, well, we spend $50 to save $1,000. So we're net $950 saved on cleanup cost, and we have the same amount of pollution cleanup. And only if all firms had the same marginal cost would there be no opportunity to reallocate responsibility for cleanup, and in order to achieve lower cost of cleanup. Now, if the government knew which firm was the low-cost cleaner-upper and which was the high-cost, the government could just set out responsibilities for cleanup and make it compensate for tax breaks or whatever to make it all even out. But the government has no knowledge to allocate pollution cleanup responsibility in an efficient way. The government simply doesn't have information on firm costs. Even firms likely don't know the cost of cleanup until they're actually forced to do it. So that isn't going to work. But there are two strategies available that do work. A pollution tax, where we charge a certain amount per ton emitted, and that gives firms that can clean up cheaply, they'll clean up. Well, I'd rather clean up. It's cheaper to clean up a ton of pollution than it is to pay a tax on that emission, so I'm going to clean up. So that tax will get firms that can clean up cheaply to clean up, and then a firm that would be run out of business by having to clean up, well, they say, hey, I just soon pay the tax. It's cheaper for me to pay the tax than clean up, and I can stay in business. And of course, a tax brings in government revenue even while increasing the efficiency of the market outcomes. There's a lot to like about that. The problem with a tax that Frank touched on, I'm not so convinced it's such a big problem, but the problem of a tax is you really have to experiment with a tax. Since we don't know costs, it's easy to either set a tax that's too high or a tax that's too low. But if we had pollution targets, we could start out with a low tax, see how firms respond, the next iteration, raise the tax if we don't get enough cleanup, and so on until we arrive at the right level of cleanup. And then over time, we'd have created a big incentive for firms to clean up. We could adjust the tax as necessary. I mean, the big problem of taxing, it's not such a problem, right? But if you tax pollution, you give firms in the long run an incentive to clean up more, and pretty soon you lose your tax base. But what a problem to have. Things are too clean, there's too little pollution to tax it and earn revenues. Well, then we could go back to taxing income work effort and investment effort, the things we'd like to encourage. Let's go through an example of how a tax works to achieve a lower cost cleanup. And realize, I'm going to go through the case for the tax, but realize if we auctioned off permits, firms would pay what they think those, we could set the amount of cleanup if we issue permits. We auction them off, firms could buy, would set a price based on what they think it would cost, and then we let firms trade to adjust if they were wrong. That's a cap and trade program that's talked about a lot in the context of carbon regulation. Anyway, let's take this simple example. Let's suppose there's just two firms, and let's start from a situation where the government says both Sludge Oil and Northwest Lumber have to clean up 2 tons. We want to reduce pollution by half. So without regulation, they each emit 4 tons a day. With regulation, if we were going to do a command and control, they'd both reduce their output from 4 tons a day to 2 tons a day. Well, let's think about costs. Notice that Sludge Oil had to develop a process, a different way of doing things that was cleaner, that increased its cost from 100 to 600. That's 500. I'm just going to call this C and C. 500 plus, we see Northwest Lumber, their costs went up by 80. Oops, thought I had my pen working. There we are. So cleanup costs are 580 under this. Everybody cleans up half. Well, let's suppose instead that the government set a tax, and if it started low, notice that a tax of $20, $21 a ton, at that tax, Northwest Lumber would say, hey, we'd clean up, we'd go to process B, we'd clean up 1 ton, because that's cheaper than paying the tax. Then we'll pay the tax on the 3 tons we do emit. But Sludge Oil wouldn't clean up anything under that kind of a tax. Well, that's only 1 ton. We wanted to clean up 4 tons, right? We were emitting 8 tons, 4 tons each. We want to get down to 4. So a tax of 20 is too low. Let's raise the tax. We see if we go up to 60, that moving from B to C costs another $60 to do. Well, so a tax of 61 would get Northwest to clean up 2 tons, but again, it would fail to get Sludge to clean up anything, and we'd only have 2 tons cleaned up. So a sad tax of 60 isn't going to work. Let's raise it. How much do we have to raise it? If we raise it to 100 or 101, say, notice that Northwest will clean up 1 more ton, and then Sludge will clean up a ton, because process B would increase Sludge's cost by 100. If there's a tax of 101, it would be cheaper for Sludge to go with process B. Well, there we are, a tax of 101. $101 per ton tax. What are our cleanup costs? Now Sludge is paying 100, and then Northwest is, let's see, their costs went up by 180, right? They were at 300, now they're doing a process that costs 180. And then we have 280. So that's quite a reduction. Notice that the government also collects a new $404 of tax revenue, because Sludge is emitting 3 tons at process B, and Northwest is emitting 1 ton at process A. Now, firms, even though cleanup costs are lower, firms object to the tax because firms aren't thinking through what the costs to society are. They're thinking their tax bill plus their cleanup costs are pretty high. So that's why firms will oppose taxes. In the late 80s and early 90s, under George Bush the First and under Bill Clinton, we moved to a system of tradable permits for regional pollutants, sulfur dioxide, a lot of different air pollutants. And the program was so successful, there was a test program instituted by H.W. Bush, and then it was so successful that Bill Clinton expanded it to all regional pollutants and in early 90s. And it's been a fantastic success story by government. We've gotten the same amount of cleanup, but the costs of cleanup have been reduced more than by half. So we only pay 40% of what we used to pay to clean up the same amount of pollutants. That's remarkable when politicians and their staffs can figure out a way to get the same benefits at less than half the cost. So that's one of the real success stories in regulatory history. And of course, there's a reason why we advocate for tradable permits, auction permits though, so we get some tax revenue for the carbon abatement to address global warming concerns. Firms would much rather get permits given to them than pay for them in an auction. So that's why we do it that way in the United States. It's a very generous situation, but it's politically feasible because firms only have to trade the permits if they're better off by trading them, and so it's a win-win for firms. It's from the point of view of society, it would be desirable to get tax revenue so we could lower taxes on, we could lower corporate taxes, personal income taxes. We could shift taxes away from good things and put them onto pollution to the full extent possible. Socially, we'd be better off. But economic agents naturally tend to view things from their own perspective, not from the perspective of society. But as economists, we tend to take the view from the perspective of society, and it gets us to a different place and a different set of recommendations.